down, on prey, onward gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters on the Fight Laugh Feast Network and Boniface Media. And I want to commend to you the Puritan Treasures series. If you want to start reading the Puritans, but you don't know where to start, Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. You can learn more about this series, Puritan Treasures for Today, at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. If you check out in your cart, if you'll enter the promo code EMatters to your order, you will get 10% off from the Puritan Treasures series. So today I'm joined by, I think, three-time, I think, returning guest. Yeah, it's getting up there. You get a sticker at some point. Dr. Kim Riddlebarger, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to do it, Josh.
So for those of you who don't know Dr. Riddlebarger, there's much to say. We've had you on the channel before. Your book, The Case for Amillennialism, among many others, has been just kind of a foundational work for many in eschatology. But you have, I'll let you, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Riddlebarger, just tell us what you're up to, and be sure to commend to the listener the Riddle blog and everything you've got going on there.
Oh, thank you. I'm retired pretty much, so I'm no longer a full-time pastor. So I have plenty of free time in the evenings now. So I keep a blog. The Riddle blog's been around a long time. And I'm now doing a podcast on the letters of Paul called the Blessed Hope Podcast. So I've been spending much time with the apostle these days. I'm in 1 Corinthians and really enjoying working through that stuff. There's so much there for the church today. And we forget that that's a really important letter for the church. And Reformed folk kind of shy away from it because we prefer Romans or Ephesians or Galatians, but there's a lot in 1 Corinthians that confirms not only good old-fashioned Reformed theology, but tackles a lot of tough questions today. So I do that, and then answer a lot of questions on eschatology. People still know where to find me, so I stay pretty busy.
Awesome. Well, I'm grateful for your free time because it means you can join us for another Eschatology Matters episode. But
Sure.
We're tackling the four approaches, kind of the four ways of reading the Revelation. There's more that's wrapped up in these, obviously, but that's primarily what we've been looking at is four main ways of reading the Revelation. So we've been looking at the idealist approach, the futurist approach, the historicist approach. Eventually, we'll get to the historicist approach, and then also the preterist approach. We've noted that there's usually a little bleed over within these categories. Usually these aren't very cut and dried, but they're helpful tools and they're helpful ways of looking at this. They're ways we can try to be consistent, at least with our interpretive modes. But if you would, Dr. Riddlebarger, just give kind of an overview of your approach to the Revelation, how you're approaching it, and just walk us through that, if you would.
Okay, great question, because Revelation is a complicated book. We all want to try and ram it into one of those categories or the other. But I think most, at least on my side, most of the guys who would be so-called idealists in the amillennial camp really have kind of an eclectic view because of the nature of the letter. I mean, it is an epistle. It is sent to a particular church. It has an epistolary greeting and an ending, a benediction. So it's a letter in its structure and form. It's filled with prophecy. I mean, John mentions numerous times of prophecies in the book. So it's in a letter. It's also prophecy, and its genre is apocalyptic. And because we don't have any contemporary literature like apocalyptic in the ancient world, it's very easy for people to ram all kinds of baggage into that and claim that they're doing whatever it is that they think Revelation ought to be telling us. So I approach the book as though it is written to a first century congregation, the seven churches, particularly in Asia Minor. If you look carefully at the map, the seven churches follow the postal route of the ancient Roman world. So I don't see any sense in trying to make those seven churches epics in church history. I think it's written to contemporary churches all struggling. And therefore, in the way I read Revelation, with the historical stuff in the foreground, Rome persecuting Christians in the first century, Nero's fingerprints everywhere in the background. I'm with preterists on that pretty much. But what happens in the first century then epitomizes what will happen until Christ returns at the end of the age. So Revelation is not a details book. It drives architects and math guys and engineers crazy because it doesn't have the precision. Musicians and artists tend to get Revelation better than the guy who works at Boeing or IBM. There's just something about this book that I recommend it for people to listen to Max McLean read it out loud. It's an entirely different book when you hear it than it is when you read and study. So it's got its own unique sort of thing going, and there really are no contemporary analogs to it. So that's what makes it hard. But it is a letter. It isn't prophecy. It is apocalyptic. So if we look at it in its structure, it's easy to see what's in the book is what's going on in the first century. And yet what happens in the first century with the persecution of the church ends up being a picture to Christians in subsequent generations of the kinds of things that will happen until the Lord returns. So it's telling us that what you see with Nero, what you see with the beast, what you see with the false prophet, that's going to characterize what the church will face. Not at all times and in every place, but those kinds of things will be going on continuously until the time of the end. And as I read the book, things do get worse at the time of the end. So there's a futurist kind of futurist whiff there of how I would understand the book. In terms of its structure, I think most reform guys who tackle it, Dennis Johnson, G.K. Bill, and others, are pretty much right. Well, back to William Hendrickson. It's a series of 7 repeating visions. And so as you go through the book, there are 7 consecutive visions. Each vision is a picture of the entire interadvental age from a different perspective. So, for example, the first cycle of visions would be the apostolic church. And, the Lord walking among the lampstands, the letters directed to each of the churches, letters of commendation and condemnation. So that would characterize the church on earth throughout the entire interadvental age, even though those churches are really struggling with the things that the Lord rebukes them or encourages them for. That becomes a picture of what Christians are going to face until the time of the end. Then you get the second cycle where you've got the idea of the scene, heavenly scene, and that's really the only glimpse we get in the Bible of the New Testament. On and on, the trumpets, the bowls, and so on, till you get to the final vision, which begins in Revelation chapter 20, and it too views the interadvental period in its entirety in those 3 chapters, beginning with the binding of Satan, which is in a book of symbols and apocalyptic language, is a picture to us of the gospel going forward and binding Satan so that, as John tells us, he can no longer deceive the nations. So the best way to make sense of that is from Dennis Johnson's book, Triumph of the Lamb, with great commentary and revelation. Highly recommend it. And Dr. Johnson suggests that each of these 7 epochs, each of these 7 cycles that repeat throughout the book, entire interadvental period in each one, view them as though you're watching Monday Night Football. And you're out in the producer's truck and you've got 7 cameras going during the game. So one camera will focus on the sideline behavior. One camera will focus on the line of scrimmage. One camera will focus on and kind of an end zone view or an isolated view. Anyway, you've got 7 cameras all looking at the same thing. But if you're looking at just one camera, it's going to have an entirely different take on the game than the others will. And I think that's a really helpful way to try and understand the book of Revelation. It's 7 repeating cycles. And I think that just makes perfect sense of the book. So the idea here is so many people have turned the book of Revelation into some sort of esoterica mysteries that you have to have a guru to figure it out. It's a very simple book and it's big message. Christ is Lord over all. He wins in the end, and believers will be with him as he triumphs over evil in the world. So that's the way I would read and handle it.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you for walking us through that. I love the 7 camera angles idea too, because I think that is what everybody would recognize. There's scene changes within Revelation, even those who might not read it that way. But I'm sticking with your analogy there, is that those scene changes throw us off and we feel like we're in a different story than we were looking at those 7 camera angles. I really like that viewpoint. I'm wondering, this is a bit off script, Dr. Riddlebarger, so forgive me for this, but I'm just thinking toward the overlap. It seems like there's a lot of idealist elements in most takes to the Revelation. In other words, if you were to think of like how these different interpretive approaches to the Revelation kind of intersect with very,
Right.
depending on who you're talking about. But it seems like you pick up on idealism in a lot of circles. Would that be fair to say that kind of crops up in most approaches to whatever degree?
If you're talking about a more eclectic idealism, the answer would be yes, because the traditional idealist view is it gets really Platonic, that this is just about a good and evil. The symbols can be kind of mutated into anything. You get this notion of ideal forms and things falling out into matter. And you could Platonists in the church have tended to read Revelation along the idealist lines, and that's really not helpful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is a lot of bleed over. For example, in the description I just gave, the historicists are right in the sense that the book of Revelation is going to talk about the future of the church on the earth, but they're wrong in tying it to particular historical events. So if you're looking at a historicist view, this book is a map to the future. It's a map to how Christians ought to understand the cataclysmic things that happen on the earth. So you get the older historicists talk, this book is about the fall of the Roman Empire. Then you get the heretical schisms in Christianity. Then you get to European power brokers like Frederick the Great and Napoleon, others who were creating all kinds of havoc in Europe. And the reformers, of course, thought this was showing us why the papacy is coming under God's judgment. And so the truth in it is it's reading things progressively across time. The seven visions do work toward the final vision, which is of the interadvental period ending with the coming of Christ. So you get some of that. You get some of that in the historicist view.
Okay.
As for the futurists, I believe in a future Antichrist. I think that he's clearer in Second Thessalonians probably, and perhaps in the epistles of John than the book of Revelation. But I think there's going to be an end time persecutor of the church, the epitome of evil. And I think there's signs throughout the Pauline epistles and the Gospels that Revelation kind of puts a capstone on, that in the last days things will get incredibly horrible. There'll be great persecution of the church. There's a great apostasy, a revelation of man of sin, as Paul says, which I take to be a pretty strong parallel to what we see in Revelation chapter 20, where Paul talks about the principle of evil already being at work. Well, John talks about Satan being bound. John talks about Satan being released. Paul speaks of the man of sin appearing when the restraint ceases. So those seem to me to be parallel texts. So there is a bit of futurism in my view as well. But I think the eclectic notion that we have to read this book as it's given, historical stuff in the foreground, which means Nero is going to be present. The preterists are right to find certain things in the book of Revelation that speak to pre-70 stuff, but they're wrong to say there's no eschatology after D70. The book of Revelation is wrapped up, complete, that's it. They miss the fact that apocalyptic literature is intended to give us big picture stuff behind the historical details. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think all those views have some reason why people hold them. Mm-hmm. The weakest, I think, is the historicist position, because the tendency is to make the great interpretive sin of tying the things in the book of Revelation to very specific historical events. And you go back in church history and look how well-intended, brilliant people tied their wagon to something that just didn't happen.
Right.
That view becomes pretty difficult. As far as the papacy, I mean, the Reformed confessions, the Westminster Confession is pretty clear. Papam est verum antichristum. I mean, they can't get more difficult, more straightforward than that. I think the Westminster Confession, I would take a mild exception to on that, because I think there have been elements of the Antichrist in the papacy. But as I read the book of Revelation, the Roman Catholic Church is pretty weak and impotent these days, and they're having their own internal set of problems with lawsuits and all kinds of other stuff. And back in the days of the Reformers, Rome was able to marshal armies from Spain and Italy and France to invade the Low Countries and kill Reform guys by the thousands. So if you're living in that set of circumstances, yeah, that sounds a lot like the Antichrist. But today, these same nations are socialists. They're having a hard time raising enough stuff to defend themselves against the possible invasion from the Russia and Ukraine situation. So
right.
Times have changed, and that's why we have to be really careful not hitching our wagon to some sort of historical event, because Revelation is talking about the Roman Empire in the first century and how that's going to keep coming back again and again, but in non-specific terms. It's not detailed. It's big picture, boxed up to the puzzle kind of thing. Keep that. Don't pick up the pieces and spend all your time twiddling with them, because that's not going to give you an answer. Box top, big picture, big picture.
So this question might be superfluous at this point because you've just filled in a lot of the details. But what I was going to ask was, how do we read the Revelation insofar as what sort of story is it telling? And like I said, you've already filled in a whole lot of that. This is a story of Christ's victory. You're talking about the restraint of Satan, the triumph of the church, the persecution against the church, those sort of things. But maybe would there be anything more you would add to when somebody, we kind of work through how to approach the Revelation, then we're trying to, reckon with what sort of story is this? What sort of story is it communicating, or successive tellings of the same story?
Right.
Anything more you'd want to add to that sort of overview?
Yeah, I think the problem for us Gentiles, 2,000 years removed from the Hellenic Greco-Roman world, where Jews of that era, whether they were Hellenists or Hebraic, they knew the Old Testament, many of them from memory. Paul certainly did. We are so far removed, we don't know the Old Testament well enough in the original languages. I certainly don't. So when I hear a word like locust, I know immediately go back to Job, and I know immediately what Job was talking about. He's talking about locusts are utterly destructive. And anybody who's seen a locust plague in the ancient world knew that that meant death, because they're going to eat everything that animals ate, that you ate, all of that. There's a locust plague, I think, in Algeria in like the 1910s. It killed 200,000 people, something. So the ancient people knew how dangerous this was. And so they weren't trying to say, gee, that might be ancient tech, that might be future technology that we ancients don't understand. So I bet that's a Bell UNB Huey helicopter. Yeah, that's how we should read the book of Revelation. If we know our Old Testament, a lot of the symbols that are found in the book that progressively work toward the final coming of Christ are Old Testament through and through. I think there are 300 citations, something like that, or echoes from Old Testament passages in Revelation. So if we want to understand the book of Revelation, whenever we come across something that's symbolic, we don't go to the newspaper, we go back to the Old Testament. What was the Old Testament picturing? What was it trying to tell us Jesus would do? So I don't know about you. I preached the Revelation. It was far easier than I thought it was going to be. And there's Christ-centered application in every line of it. It's the most Christ-centered book I found in the entirety of my 25 years of preaching. I loved preaching it, and I did my best to remove it from the category esoterica or weird to this is about Jesus winning. This is about his conquest of the triumph over unbelief, and how the nations are going to rage, and how while it looks like the forces of Satan are winning, they're actually losing. And that's essentially what I get from Revelation chapter 20, that, here are martyrs coming out of this great tribulation, which is not a dispensational tribulation, but the whole period of time. And even though the dragon's able to put them to death and persecute God's people and do all kinds of horrible things, when a saint dies, they enter the presence of Christ and they've won. So I think Christ's victory is the background to understand all the symbols. And then we go to the Old Testament to figure out what is John picking up on from the Old Testament.
Perfect. Recommended reading sources for people who are, because like you said, you preached through this. This is one of the most sought after books that Christians want to hear preached. It's also frequently one of the ones least preached. So it's a challenging book, but what sort of scholarship, or maybe even lay level readings? You've mentioned Dennis Johnson. Be sure to include what you've written in there, please. But what sort of readings would you suggest for those who are trying to handle this?
I think the best introductory book is Vern Poythress's book. Let me pull up. I got Show and Tell Time. The Returning King is a really good place to start for somebody who this is all new. So that's the lay entry level. Next up would be Dennis Johnson's Triumph of the Lamb. And you've all probably seen this. It's absolutely a great book. This replaces William Hendrickson. Hendrickson was the first book Baker Bookhouse ever published, his commentary on the Book of Revelation. It was gold for guys of my generation, but for you younger folk, you children. See, now that I'm old, I can do stuff like that.
That's right.
This is the single best commentary on Revelation for most readers. And I heartily encourage you to get it. Dr. Johnson's a good guy. It's a great book, understandable. Then for scholarly, there are two books that I think I'd highly recommend. One is Richard Balcomb's Essays, Climax of Prophecy. And he deals with themes in the book of Revelation, not a commentary, and it's not an easy book. But if you use the index in the back, you can get at the stuff you're looking for. And it's really helpful to provide historical context back, especially with the preterist interaction with first century stuff. Balcomb does a good job of showing how that stuff actually points ahead. So I have kind of a love-hate relationship with preterists because I think they're right to tie the book to the first century. I think they're wrong to chop all the eschatology out of it. All that happens after 8070. And the biggest argument against preterism has always been that if the temple had been destroyed by 8070, why do we have no record of Christians using the destruction of the temple as an argument against Judaism? The fact that that is not mentioned anywhere in any of the records, I think, makes it pretty clear that it hadn't happened yet. So, then there's Greg Beale's masterful commentary on the Book of Revelation. Tough going. Anybody who's a preacher, there's 1,000 sermons in this, and again, you can get at it by going to the scripture index and finding, if you're in Isaiah, you're in the closing chapter of Isaiah, and you want to figure out, well, the applications could be new creation from the Book of Revelation. So you've got all that kind of stuff to work through. Now, I'm Paul guy. I'm currently working through Paul's letters, so I haven't looked at scholarly stuff in Revelation in a couple of years. I know Tom Schreiner's a commentary. I respect him as a scholar. There are several others that are working on it. There are always great commentaries coming out, but it's going to be hard for anybody to write a better commentary on the Book of Revelation than G.K. Beale. That's the gold standard.
And if you ever want to get the short version of it, you can get his shorter commentary,
right.
which is, I think, still 4,000 pages or something like that. So
yeah.
400 pages.
You don't want a shorter commentary from G.K. Beale. You want Dennis Johnson for a shorter commentary. Right.
That's excellent. Thank you for the overview. This is a great, I think, overview of the view. So again, Dr. Riddlebarger, thank you so much. You're an encouragement. You've been a friend to our show since it hopped off, and you're very helpful with this sort of things, taking a lot and making it accessible. So thank you for the walkthrough, sir.
Thank you very much, and I want to commend you for what you've done. I mean, I think I gave a book for something way back when you're just starting off.
Right.
And to see how big the channel's got and how many viewers you get, you're doing great work. So keep it up. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it. And God bless.
God bless you.
Seated here at my right